Okay, good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome to all of you here and all of you in cyberspace, wherever you may be, my good friends, those that I've met many times and now met again, the new faces. But as I always point out, everybody's really new, because if you really understand what's going on beneath the surface, even though things look like the same, as the cynics say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The fact is, however, especially today when you're familiar with quantum mechanics and modern physics, there's always brimming energy beneath the surface. And whether you know it or not, you are being renewed every moment and refreshed and revitalized. So if you ever need an antidote to boredom and monotony, you really just need to access that energy within, which is, I'll say, the objective of these classes, hopefully, to try to spark and ignite that spirit so we don't get trapped in our routines and patterns that we so often, unfortunately, get trapped in. So the topic of this class is how to overcome relationship insecurity. I know it's a loaded title, but it's something that, for good or for bad, affects us all. Because nobody is immune to insecurities and fears and all that comes with that. So I want to address it head on, as in a candid way, as best as possible, and of course in a way that we can come away with some type of tools, maybe new tools, a new way of looking at ourselves and at life in a more courageous and a more, self-confident way. So let's start, of course, with the issue itself. It's one of the hard topics to talk about. Nobody likes to talk about fears. It's one of the hardest things to talk about. Someone says to you, can you tell me your fears? Yeah, we all have our list, but when it gets to the real sensitive matters, it's like a nerve. When the doctor gets close to a raw nerve, we don't like it being touched. And we often either yell out or we say, stay away from there, and so on. The same thing is psychologically, we have more tender spots and we have more less tender spots. And the more tender it is, the more raw it is, obviously the more painful and the more difficult it is for us to address. If we were able to address all our inner, deeper psychic issues, so to speak, we would obviously be able to solve many more. One of the biggest problems, it's hard to address, and we sometimes ourselves are not even really aware of what is going on. So let's pose the question in a very direct way, which is, fact is, most people, if not all people, are afraid of their vulnerability. Why are we afraid? Because we're concerned that we will be hurt. The first and most initial reason that most of us are afraid of being vulnerable is because when we're vulnerable, we're exposed. And when we're exposed, we can be hurt. Especially if we've been hurt in the past, whether it's in relationships or in other areas. So obviously it's like a wound, and you're very careful. When a person has a wound, they stay away from situations that may open that wound again, or may hurt you again. Now interestingly, this is very exclusive to adults. The young children don't have any of these concerns. There are no children that are born with fear. That's why children are fearless, actually. And they have to be watched over because they can do things that can be actually damaging or destructive. So children don't have these phobias or fears. And the most obvious reason for it would be because they haven't been hurt yet. Hurt them enough, and they'll also develop, obviously, fears. So they're not afraid of being vulnerable because there's no reason for them to be afraid. What's wrong with being vulnerable? No. Now, I know some may argue, well, they're naive and they don't know the ways of the world. That's exactly my point. You have to know the hostilities of the world and a world that may be hurtful before you become afraid. So fear is an outgrowth of our are afraid of being hurt in one way or another. So, in that context, of course, many of our fears we are able to keep undercover. As an adult, you're able to pretty much hide many of them, and doesn't often take a lot of effort. And from time to time, we do need special effort, and we come up with creative ways to mask our fears. Some people mask them with bravado, actually. It's like the guy that said he hides his ignorance with his arrogance. Some people hide their vulnerability by being so tough that they seem to be invulnerable. Whenever you see something too invulnerable, rest assured it may be a facade. So we have our methods, we have our ways, because that's part of our so-called strategies, is the subterfuge and decoys and so on, to make sure that no one should see our vulnerability. So we develop sophisticated armor and sophisticated tools and mechanisms to protect ourselves. But there's one area in life where you can't really protect yourself from vulnerability, and that's relationships. Comes to relationships, there's no way around it. Because if you completely cover up your vulnerability, you're really not going to have a relationship. Because a relationship, by definition, means that you're opening up to someone, and they're officially opening up to you. So right there, you have no way around it if it's going to be a relationship. Now, frankly, as we shall discuss, many relationships are messed up precisely because people are not opening up. They're making believe they're opening up just to get what they need. But a relationship, if you think about it, by definition means that you're going to be vulnerable. Why? Just think of all the different questions that come up. Am I lovable? Will I be loved? Will I be rejected? Do I deserve love? What impression am I making? The list goes on. When you're in a relationship, you're already now dealing with another person. And will you trust them? Will they trust you? And all the insecurities and fears and vulnerabilities that we have accumulated in life will always emerge in relationships somewhere. Which is why so many of them fall apart very quickly, because as soon as it gets too hot in the kitchen, as they say, too uncomfortable, we're out. Again, we find all kinds of excuses. But it could very well just be chalking it up because you're not comfortable with being exposed. You're not comfortable suddenly facing a vulnerability. As I said, going to work or commuting on a commute or going shopping or going to a restaurant doesn't require you necessarily revealing your vulnerabilities, and therefore there's not that much fear. But relationships are very different, because relationship, by definition, as I said, is an emotional interaction. An emotional interaction, if it's going to be in any semi-real way, is going to require some type of risk. And that's where it gets complicated. But maybe it's also a gift, because imagine we didn't have relationships, then we would never have to expose our vulnerability, we never have to face this challenge, we never have to address it. So relationships is like the best litmus test, the best, you could say, I don't want to say laboratory, but I guess it's the best environment where person's best and worst will come out. Precisely because you can't really hide. If you want to hide, it's not going to be a relationship. I know some people think they can master the art, that I won't open up, but I'll make sure the other person opens up. Now, you just think about that arrangement, what kind of relationship that really is. That's essentially, if you want to put it manipulative, definitely, but it's not a relationship. It was like someone saying, I live behind my fortress. I'm going to make believe, I'll put on a good show that there's no fortress, but you open up all your walls and expose all your vulnerability. Who really, in their right mind, really wants such a relationship? It's safe, maybe, and maybe you can get away with it for a while, but is it healthy? Is it normal? It's not a relationship. It's basically you're using someone and faking the relationship part in it. So I know emotionally we may do this because emotionally we're sensitive and we're vulnerable and subjective, but if you think about it, it's not really a fair relationship. A person does that. Now, I'll acknowledge that many relationships exist that way on earth, and that's why relationships are suffering such a crisis, because we don't have this type of mutual vulnerability. It's either both are closed down, or one is closed and the other one is open, and it has to some way give. It's not going to last for very long. It's not sustainable. So all this is the topic that we're going to address, which of course I'm trying to dissect the issues first before we address what to do about it. So when you think about it, really relationship becomes, as I said, the platform, the environment, the laboratory. I don't want to use laboratory because it's not really an experiment, but it's the place where the the real emotional you is going to emerge with all its beauty and all its ugliness. And especially as you see, when people do finally, after they get married and they start being with each other on a regular basis, you start seeing how we're not on our best behavior all the time. You could say on a first date, on a second date, many people are on their best behavior. I mean, frankly, some people are not even then, which is even sadder. But at least then you're trying to make an impression, you're trying to be the best you can be. But once you get comfortable with another person, that's when, some of the more, let's put it, embarrassing elements of our personalities emerge. If you're a person that has a short fuse, if you're impatient, if you're judgmental, if you're obsessive, if you're critical, all these things start emerging because you start taking another person for granted. You don't have to perform. And that's why you'll see in marriage, and especially in a longer term, you'll see people either become extremely comfortable with each other, but they know everything about each other, or you start seeing a lot of ugly stuff coming out. And I'm not suggesting that you can't resolve it. I'm just pointing out that that's what happens in relationships. So the real challenge I would pose is this. Can we learn to be strong even when we're vulnerable? Does vulnerability equal fear? I proposed earlier and assumed that it does. Because since you're vulnerable, you could be hurt. And since you could be hurt, there's fear of being hurt. But we're going to discuss here that vulnerability is not equal to fear, because vulnerability is actually a very good thing if you're in a trusting environment. A child in its mother's womb is very vulnerable. More vulnerable than will ever be in life on earth. Because it's fragile, the fetus is fragile, completely dependent on its mother, it does not have the capacity to function on its own. It can't breathe, can't eat, can't drink. Completely dependent, completely vulnerable. However, it's completely protected as well. It's protected in the fetus, in the embryonic fluids, gets exactly what it needs, and therefore a fetus does not have fear because it is being provided for. Even if the mother is a neurotic, and even if the mother has a lot of psychological issues and is dysfunctional, that the way God made it is that the fetus will be protected more or less from that. Obviously, I don't even describe more horrific situations where a mother is ingesting drugs or such trauma that it will affect even the fetus. I'm talking a more normal circumstance. Extreme circumstances are extreme circumstances. To say that a fetus is completely invulnerable is not correct. I mean, there is health issues and there is unfortunately miscarriages and there are other things that can happen. But we're talking about all things equal and considered, a fetus is very much vulnerable, but also very protected. Now we wish it would continue that way once the child emerges. If the parents are healthy parents and functional parents, they'll make sure that though a child is fragile and vulnerable, especially in the early years, that child will get everything it needs. I mean, just look at a gardener, a good gardener, tending to his or her garden. Look at the care. The care. Because in the early stages of before a flower or a plant or a tree or a brush blossoms, it's extremely fragile and you need to care for it. You have to make sure that the worms and other predators don't destroy it. You have to make sure the soil is proper. It's to be proper moisture, watering, pruning, all that goes into caring for a garden. And this is not even a human being. This is a flower, vegetation, or for that matter, produce that we harvest in farms and so on. Imagine now a child. If we indeed, our parents were gardeners, what would we be like? We'd be caring for every detail. Now, good mothers and fathers will do exactly that. They'll be good gardeners. What are they doing? They're protecting the vulnerable child from outside forces, from danger, from predators, from anything that could hurt the child. Now imagine, God forbid, a scenario where parents are not doing that. The gardener ends up becoming someone that can hurt his or her own garden. That's quite a tragedy, And unfortunately we see much of that, parents who hurt their own children. Whether it's intentional or unintentional is not the issue here. We're not discussing that topic. I'm just talking about the reality that many children growing up today do not have that type of protection. So you can rest assured that that child growing up is going to be afraid of relationships. He's going to be afraid of vulnerability because his vulnerability was not always protected. And you can rest assured the other way around, that a child growing up with such gardeners, protected, will be very comfortably being vulnerable with the right people. We'll get to that soon. So vulnerability is not a problem. Vulnerability is actually the real you. The real you, stripped of our life experiences where we may have been hurt, is vulnerable. So what? So what's wrong with being vulnerable? It's only wrong with being vulnerable is when there are enemies and predators and those that could hurt us. To be vulnerable and no one else is on this earth, what's the problem with that? The problem is only when, as I said, there's no protection. And worse than that, there are forces that can hurt us. Now, think of it this way. Imagine now you're from a vulnerable child, you grow up to be an adult, and you start realizing the world is more dangerous than you thought, and you need to protect yourself. Fine, that's no problem. But imagine you forget the world of the healthy vulnerability, and you basically lock yourself up in a fortress, as I mentioned, or an armor, because this world is so dangerous, you've actually adjusted your personality. You no longer expect to be in a trusting environment because you assume that everybody's going to maybe hurt you. And many of us adjust and shift our standard. That's when it really is that's when we are, I don't say downfall, but that's when things become really difficult to deal with. It's one thing I'm looking for someone to love, I want someone to love me. I'll be vulnerable, they'll be vulnerable, and we'll embrace our vulnerability. We'll celebrate it together. However, because we live in a world I don't know who's who, so I'm careful. Proceed with caution to see. I can't just trust anybody, and I'm not just letting my guard down. That's why we have a dating process, a courtship, a process where we get to know each other. What we call due diligence, maybe it's too business-like for this purpose, but it's that idea that you're getting to know. You don't just open up. And hopefully the other person doesn't just open up. Two people, you have a conversation. And this is true, frankly, not just in romantic relationships, in all relationships. How do you really establish good friendships? It doesn't happen. Sometimes you meet someone, you right away you click and something clicks. But usually it takes time. You start seeing similar interests, similar wavelengths. We understand each other. You get each other's jokes. There's a certain camaraderie, certain kindred spirit. And there are different levels. If you look at your friends, I'm sure you'll say people who are really close friends and really get me and I get them. And there are people who are very nice, I'm good friends with, but not on that level. And then there are people who you'll be cordial with, but you won't necessarily say, I can identify with them or have a conversation with them, which is perfectly fine. We are different. When is it not fine? When there's matters of jealousy and hatred and pettiness and stuff that gets in the way. But in a normal scenario, not everybody has to be your best friend. Not everybody has to be the one that gets you or you get them. And the process of how we develop friendships like this is a process, exactly that. Sometimes takes time. Now, obviously, those of us that have been hurt more, as I mentioned, are going to have more difficulty opening up because we test more and we're less trustworthy and we're more obsessive sometimes and our antennae are up. Another person says something, you right away get very sensitive to it, sometimes overly sensitive. Now, everybody here can assess their own level of, what do we call it? Our level of sensitivity. People are different. It depends a lot on many different factors, which we can't go through all the factors. I mentioned some of them. However, the good news in this scenario is that you are expecting and hoping to meet somebody that, yes, I will open up. And I'm not looking to lock myself the rest of my life. I don't want to be locked. Because like a relationship means I will give and I will also receive. Remember, if you have a wall up, just like no one can get in, also nothing gets out. So who benefits from that? So where does it really become, I would say, even sad, even tragic, is when you give up. When you really say to yourself, you know what, I will never open up. I'm too sad, I'm too fragile, I'm too hurt, I'm too wounded. Because then what happens is then your whole mindset changes. Then you're no longer thinking in terms of, okay, where do I find the right friend, or where do I find my right soulmate and partner and so on in life. Now you basically have adjusted and you've now become a victim of circumstances. So it's one thing when you know that, yes, I may have been hurt, but you have not defined yourself by your being hurt. Once your identity shifts and you now say, my identity is one that lives in fear, no one's going to make that statement, obviously. No one's on their business card going to say, here, I'm a person that lives in fear. You can't imagine anyone saying that. But that's not, without the words, you basically determined that life is dangerous. Then what's happened is that you have allowed the hurt in your life to define you. And that is where really, that's very difficult to change. It's not impossible, but you have to recognize if that's where you are. And I'm not suggesting anyone in this room is that way or anyone listening to this, but I can tell you there are some people like that on this earth, and more than some. You know, people who have become, they identify now, they'll say hostility is the norm. Everyone is my enemy until proven otherwise. Which really means that it probably won't be proven otherwise, because once you have that type of attitude, how do you prove that you're not? Where in truth, it should be the other way around. Vulnerability is a fine thing. I just know that. I don't know yet who I can trust, and I'm waiting to open up. But I don't become a person who's been defined by my battles. Like I often say about the Jewish people, for example, or other people who've suffered. You can suffer, but it doesn't mean you've become a sufferer. You can go to war, but it doesn't mean you become a warrior. A warrior, going to war means you go to war because it's a necessity, but it doesn't defy your being that you are always at war. Now, some people have told me very directly, my life is a battle from morning to night. When I go to work, the people I meet, it's always battling. Doesn't mean I'm always fighting, but I'm always in battle mode because I never know when I'm going to be under attack. Now, you could imagine a person with such an attitude, you can rest assured, is probably inviting attack all the time because that's the mode they're in. You know, you can sometimes see it in people's body language. You can see the way they crouch or the way they curl up. You could see they're always in battle mode. They're always on the defense. Now, I'm not judging anyone. I can understand why, because some people have been very hurt. So that's their mode, you know. Like some people sleep in the fetal position for that reason, because that's the natural position because it protects you. A person who's built an identity where they feel that confidence coming from within doesn't need that type of constant defense. So some of us are living on the defensive mode almost all the time. And when you recognize that, as sad as that may be, that doesn't mean there's no hope. It means you have to recognize it. The worst of all is when someone says, no, I'm very comfortable, everything is great. How are things doing? I know more than one person, but I remember one person who used to come see me often, used to come to the class, and they were one of the people who really hurt in life, and I really, only my heart goes out to that person, and to all people like that, and to all people for that matter, in general, I should say. But you know, I met him a few years later. So he came once to the class. I say, how are things going? Excellent. So I say, stupendous, right? Because that was the word we used. That the worst days that were in his life were called stupendous. You don't say, someone says to you, okay, thank God things are pretty good. I say, stupendous, excellent. You know, can't be better, right? Once you say that, you know, can't be better. So I said, can't be better, right? But he's gotten to a point where he's so comfortable in his own misery that he has developed a certain level of, what's the word for it, desensitized to pain. For him, being in pain and being sad and lonely is normal. And that is when it really becomes difficult, because once you're comfortable with it, it's like, what's going to cause you to change? And there's no rock bottom. You're not even in pain. You're not even desperate. Now, again, I'm not saying critical. I'm just pointing out the levels of how we can suddenly, from a healthy, young, little flower child, vulnerable, when not protected and hurt, how far that can go. So it's one thing you're hurt and you know that you've been hurt, and therefore you're careful. Yeah. But you're open to find the right person. That's, as I said, that is, I can't say a perfect scenario, but it's one that you can work with. The next step is someone, no, they've closed off and they really do not believe they'll ever find anybody, or they don't believe that they can really open up because it's too risky or too fearful, and so on. And then there's someone who convinces themselves they're not even fearful. No, I'm the toughest guy on earth. Hey, I could do anything. So what about a relationship? I just didn't meet the right one. You know, how often do I hear that? I say, oh, you just didn't meet the right one. You're 45 years old, 50 years old. You're just like, there's no one around. No, I'm sure they'll come up. What usually means that person is full of fear. And again, I'm not criticizing, but they are complete denial. the only way they could survive. And I understand why, because who could live with that? I'm going to live that we're going to give up hope at age 40, at 50, 30, whatever age it is. So I want to share and say here, for the record, that no matter what category you're in of all that I just mentioned, there is always hope. There's no such thing as a dead end. If you decided there's a dead end in your life, that's your problem. You decided that. That doesn't mean there's a dead end. And the first thing that's required of everybody is a little humility. Don't write your script. You know, I've often pointed out that arrogance can take on two shapes. It can take on the shape that I'm more important than everybody, you know, a type of superiority complex. It could also take on the shape, the exact opposite shape, completely inverted, that I'm the worst person on earth. But I know that. It's just as arrogance. One arrogance is very pompous. The other arrogance is I'm a nobody. But who told you you're a nobody? Who gave you the right to decide that you're worthless? Who gave you the right to decide that you're hopeless? I know it sounds funny, but I've told this to a number of people who told me that, and they said to me, "What do you mean? That's my right. I have a right to say that. Who else has a right to say whether I'm hopeless or not?" I said, "I'm challenging you. You know, you came to see me. I'm challenging you. How do you know you're so sure? You're subjective. You've been hurt. You're blinded. Come on. How could you establish that?" Remember, in the Talmud is an interesting statement that no one can call themselves a rasha, a wicked person, and no one can call themselves a tzaddik, because we're subjective. How can you determine that you're a righteous person? Another person has to determine that. We need objectivity. But the interesting thing, the Talmud also says you can't call yourself a cruel person or a wicked person, because you're also not objective. You know, maybe you're being too harsh on yourself. Maybe you think that you're a product of your circumstances or a victim, and you decided a person like me is worthless. A person like me does not deserve love. A person like me is helpless, or whatever it is. So both are coming from a lack of humility. And humility makes only one statement. You didn't create yourself. You were put here on this earth. You're not a self-made person. And you have to ask God what He thinks about you. You ever think about that? Did you consider maybe you should get an opinion by the Creator? It's like someone buying a computer, coming home and saying, "This is a piece of junk," and you throw it in the garbage. Why? Because you didn't know how to use it. Or you didn't follow the operator's manual. It was too complex. Maybe you didn't just think of reading the operator's manual. Maybe think of calling the manufacturer or the owner or the creator, the engineer, the builder of this machine. Maybe they'll have something to say. You didn't think of that? No, you're convinced it's worthless. That's the equivalent. And it's fascinating because the Torah tells us basically, you don't have a right to talk about yourself in these derogatory ways. Not just about others, about yourself too. You didn't create yourself. Someone gives you a gift. Yeah, I give you a gift, a beautiful gift. So yes, it's yours now. Is it appropriate for you to go take the gift and just throw it out the window and burn it, especially, and let me know? You know? You don't want to use it, don't use it, put it aside. You have a gift was given to you called life. You cannot suddenly decide to say, you know what, this life is worthless, it's hopeless. It's not yours to determine that. So you have an interesting halacha, Jewish law, that says you're not allowed to self-mutilate yourself. You're not allowed to self-mutilate. For example, you're not allowed to make scars on your body or in any way hurt yourself. Now you could argue, 1 second, I don't understand why. What's wrong with that, doing that? I can hurt someone else, obvious, that makes sense. What right do you have to hurt someone else? But this is my own body. It's my own being. Why can't I hurt myself? I feel I need to cut myself or something like that. There's a specific prohibition. And it's interesting, the Radbaz, one of the commentaries on the Maimonides, when says, because your body is God's property, not your property. Who told you it's yours? Yes, in context of legalities, yes, your body is not someone else's property, but it's not yours either. It's God's property. And can you just go on someone's property and start scarring it or damaging it or burning it or doing something? It's simply not the right thing to do. Now, you could say, 1 second, I want to do what I want. Who said I have to listen to God? Okay, fine, that you'll take up with God and say, some people say, I don't even believe in God. That's fine too. Remember, just because you don't believe in a creator doesn't mean you weren't created. It just means you don't want to acknowledge it. That's fine. That's like someone saying, hey, I'm reading a book. I decided there's no author. This book was written by itself. And fine, you want to feel that way? Fine. But the bottom line is there is an author. So just because you don't acknowledge it doesn't mean there isn't an author. But anyway, going back to the point here, more importantly, I'm not here trying to prove God's existence or not. I'm just trying to establish something else. The idea that your life is sacred, that your life is dignified, that your life is special, is something you should never, ever, in your mind, try to undermine. That's like undermining your very being. That's really the point I'm making here. And the fact that you don't feel good about yourself, fine, that's your feelings. That doesn't take away the sanctity and dignity of your life. That's the main thing to remember. And that's why we do need a God, because sometimes in our own subjective, blinded ways, we decide all kinds of things about ourselves that are simply not true. That's why you need an objective opinion. Who are you to say that it's hopeless? So whatever circumstance, going back to the theme I'm discussing, whatever circumstance you're in, the key thing you have to always remember that there's a part of you that is deeper than any scar or wound that has touched you. People, God forbid, we see today miracles of medicine. Sometimes people go through an accident and you see their entire body gets burned and scarred. And obviously I'm not wishing it upon anyone, but it's tremendous to see the regenerative powers of healing that the human body contains. Like any good doctor will tell you, we don't heal. We facilitate healing. The body has its natural healing process. No doctor can cause cause the blood to coagulate or clot. Yeah, there's medication that can speed it up. There's medication to thin the blood or to thicken the blood and so on. But the human body, like nature itself, has a natural regenerative and healing process. Think about that for a moment. I don't know if you've ever taken a tour in these forests after forest fires, and they show you where the place there were fires, and they show you how the magic, literally, of how a forest grows after a fire, and how the fire actually in many ways revitalizes the forest. And that's why it's healthy in certain situations that there be fires or other forms of like cleaning out the old in order to make room for the new. So if there was no, for example, human beings in the path of natural disasters, like volcanoes, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, and so on, tsunamis, it wouldn't be a tragedy. Every 2 minutes there's an earthquake somewhere beneath the sea. This is necessary for the proper balance of the Earth's structure and its magnetic field and its atmospheres. If there were no earthquakes and there were no volcanoes, eruptions, and all that, we would not be able to survive. The tragedy is when human beings are on that path or are on that fault. So then it can cause severe damage and destruction. So the idea is the universe is made up of its own natural vacuum cleaner is essentially the wind. Its own natural cleaning system is rain and storms and so on. So the earth, in general, nature has its own built-in regenerative and healing process. And the same thing is with the human body. It's fascinating. You see a cut, just observe how every day how it heals itself, or other things in our being. So just apply that logic now to your psychological state of being. We may be wounded psychologically, as I mentioned, and that just may be, unfortunately we are at times. But the question is, does that wound heal? Now here's where it gets complicated. If you get a cut on your finger, whether you like it or not, whether you're in a good mood or a bad mood, that cut's going to heal. It really doesn't affect, you can't really do anything. I mean, I'm not, God forbid, somebody who keeps opening up the wound and is cutting themselves. But in the general process, it doesn't matter whether you're in a good mood, a bad mood, and so on. Psychological healing, however, requires one more element, your cooperation. If you are not going to allow the healing process to take place, some things won't heal. And that's why it's so critical, the point I made before, that you need to have that faith and trust in the dignity of your life. Because if you don't have that, then there is a natural healing process that we can all deal with anything in life. But you are now an enemy to yourself. You become your own worst enemy because you're fighting that healing because you don't believe it's possible. And I repeat again, in physical healing, it doesn't require your cooperation. It just requires that you don't do anything destructive. It doesn't require. The healing process will happen if you just let it be. When it comes to psychological healing, it doesn't happen quite that way. You can be a big problem. You can be the source of all the problems because if you determine that those wounds define you, then you don't open yourself up to new opportunities. It'd be like a person who knew how to swim very well. Just use a simple example. Then they got into some accident or they were injured and they're afraid to go into water. And it's completely in their head. It's not like they can't swim. They know how to swim. But once it gets in your head, you're afraid to go into water because of the fear. So what is a good coach going to do? They'll help you get beyond your fear, and then once you get into the water, you realize, hey, there's nothing to be afraid of. It was in my mind. It was in my head. The same as psychologically. What happens is often we get hurt, and we start defining ourselves by that, and we say, I've hurt. Who wants to be with me? I'm worthless. I'm an inferior. I don't deserve love. Once you make statements like that, you know what you're doing. You're not just not healing. You're actually you're bringing upon yourself, you're creating an identity that's not real. You're creating a new identity. So based on what happened to you, you've suddenly need to change your identity. And you've changed your identity. What do you expect? You're going to go on a date, and you're projecting that type of energy, even if you don't say it, but it's very obvious that you see yourself as a worthless piece of garbage. I don't mean to put it so bluntly. So what do you think? Another person's not going to pick up on that? The ones that won't pick it up are the ones that also see themselves worthless like that, because then, they may identify with you. Okay, great. What kind of relationship is that going to turn into? Won't go there. And where is that going to end up? But what do you think? I mean, I'm sure everyone here, anyone listening to this, I'm sure you've gone into rooms, a party, an event, or just meet someone, and we pretty much pick up vibes. Can't say it from every person, but if a person has a negative vibe, most of us are going to pick it up. You go to a party, you can immediately tell if the hosts are in bad mood, because then everybody's in a bad mood. The waiters, the guests, you know how it is. It starts like dripping down from the top. When you see people are obnoxious, it pretty much gets contagious. The whole environment gets obnoxious. Now, some people may enjoy obnoxious behavior, so they hang out there. But if you're a little sensitive human being with a little, what's the word? A little sensitivity, I guess is the word. I'm looking for another word. I don't have it. In such environments, you feel. I mean, I'm sure you go to places you just don't feel good. You feel very uncomfortable. You feel self-conscious. Everybody's self-conscious. I'm sure you've seen that. Then you go to a wedding or a party or a place where people are pleasant. From the top down, it spills down too. No one has to say. There's no sign that says this is a pleasant environment here. You pretty much pick it up. Would you agree? Now, of course, there are times it's neutral. You're not really sure. You could have one person's like this, one person's like that. I'm using extreme examples just to point out that you don't need to always declare what you are and what kind of vibe that you give off. Now, I always bring this up because I guess I'd be a little mischievous, but it's a little uncomfortable, frankly. There are people that you meet that every time you're around them, you feel drained. You're any such people. You don't have to mention names. And then there are people you meet, every time you're around them, you feel empowered. No, they're just positive. You feel hopeful. You feel everything's possible. What's going on exactly? It's a lot to do with what kind of person that is. Now, this doesn't mean one person has suffered and one person has not. One person has not become a sufferer. Many people talk about being children of Holocaust survivors, which is its own class of category. It needs its own type of therapy. And they grow up often in homes where the parents, the survivors, make you feel guilty all the time because they feel guilty. They feel guilty that they survived. They feel angry and bitter of what happened to them. And I'm not judging, obviously, people like that. I'm not judging anyone. But that creates an environment. You go up in a home where you become very much, it's like haunted. Remember, what was that film with that Holocaust survivor? His son was the musician. Shine, right? Yeah, remember, you saw that? It's a tragic story. It's a true story. It was a health guy. What was the name of the classic pianist? Anyway, the Holocaust survivor whose son is a genius pianist, and literally due to his father's anger and guilt and intensity, drives his son literally off his mind. He ends up in a institution. Then he comes back at the end of I think it was not Helfgott, it was, I forgot his name. Anyway, Shine was there. But you see it, it's a very painful movie to see. I saw it, I couldn't believe it that they actually show it, because it's real, very real. It's not like one of these sugar-coated things. You really see it, and it's very subtle. It's not like direct abuse. It's just his father's presence, that intensity, you have to be perfect. And if he wasn't exactly perfect, you're letting down, betraying our whole family because we're the only ones that survived, And, there's scenes, they're very subtle scenes, like just the father looking at a barbed wire in their home. The point I'm making here is these are people who've become literally damaged by their experiences, and it's not judgment, and as a result, damage those around them. That's how it is. Now, the good news is we do not have to be victims. We could correct it, but the key to correcting it is honesty. You can't go into denial and make believe everything is great. If indeed a person has an identity that is in some way shifted due to our negative experiences, you must come to terms and recognize this is an identity that's not really me, and this is how I'm masquerading. I may be comfortable in this miserable identity, but it's not you. That's why it's so vital to go back to what I said earlier, that you don't have a right to define yourself. Because if you do that, and I'm not saying that because I'm trying to take away your rights, that's not my point here. Because if you do that, you're doing the worst possible thing. You are becoming, you who's giving all these negative images is actually determining and writing your own doomsday script. Is that what you want? You want to find out when you're 80 years old that you wrote yourself a script, and that was, had you not done that, you could have gotten around it? It's the worst possible thing that you can come, because it's one thing you could say, okay, my choice was taken away from me, someone else did it. But to find out that you were a participant in your own hopelessness, that's not a very pleasant type of thought. I apologize if I'm coming across too harsh, but I just want to say it bluntly, as I think you've probably gotten used to, I like to talk about things openly here, because I really believe that you have to sometimes shake ourselves up to get out of this type of place, of this hopeless or fatalistic view on our lives. And to do that, you have to go deeper than where the wound was. And I say again, we are naturally healing entities. We will always heal, unless we do something to stop that healing. And in psychological terms and emotional terms, we do that by either not believing in ourselves, not believing in the force that created us, and not believing in the ability that your soul is deeper than your pain. You must know that, because that's where the hope will come. That's like saying, okay, the waters may have gotten polluted, but those are the outer waters. Dig deeper, deeper and deeper, and you'll find the wellspring, and there the waters are pure. And sometimes fine. There was a lot of pain, a lot of wounds, a lot of hurt, and you are afraid of being vulnerable again. So dig deeper, and you'll find the place that you were even pre-birth, the fetal state where you were completely vulnerable but also completely protected. It exists. The fact that you haven't seen it yet, or you haven't found it, is because you haven't dug enough, or you have not had people around you that helped you dig, because you can't always do it yourself. I always say one of the easiest things to change in a person's life, you say, okay, where did we begin? One of the easiest things going back to is our environment, the people we hang around with. The sad thing and the interesting thing is misery loves company. Usually people who are hopeless, for some reason, feel more comfortable to be around other hopeless people, because it reinforces their beliefs. And also being around people who are hopeful makes you feel, makes you feel something's wrong with you. So it's like wanting to be around people who have given up, so to speak. I know it sounds pretty what shall I say? What?
Very true.
Yeah, it's very true, but it also is very sad, because again, what you're doing is creating something which is creating a scenario. It's like you get used to toxic air, and that's what you want to hang out with. I like toxic air because that's what I'm used to. And someone gives you a fresher breath, you start coughing and saying, hey, something's wrong with that air. Yeah, something's wrong with it because you haven't got used to it. So I'm not suggesting cold turkey, but I think it's important to maybe look at who you hang around with, what environment you hang around with. I feel blessed that in my own childhood and my own, adult life as well, as I've grown, I've seen a lot. And there were times I was much more naive than I am today. But I have blessed to be around healthy people in my life. Not all, but many. Enough to know what the standard is, and not to convince myself that toxicity is healthy. And it's a very big issue who you hang around with. I think the Koreans say that you will be judged not by who you are, but by which friends you kept. I don't know, judge is, I don't like the word judge, so maybe let's just use, you will be identified by more who you hang around with than who you are, because who you hang around with is somewhat of an expression of what you feel. So the first step, I would make a strong suggestion or recommendation. If you do have people that drain you and that reinforce your negative image, maybe I'll spend a little less time with them and try to fill time to spend with other type. Try to find people that make you feel uplifted. And I'm not talking about people just, who are delusional. I'm talking about people who are just by nature pleasant, uplifting, life-affirming. You feel things...
People that are nice to you.
Okay, that's a nice way to put it, yeah. And people who believe in you. People who believe that things are possible. It's one of the greatest things to have in life is people who cheer you on, who like are your cheerleaders, who say you can do it, and they root for you. And that's a very simple process. I know it's not so easy always to do because, we're used to our old friends, but it's one of the easier ways because you're not talking about necessarily changing everything from within. That's hard to do. But you're changing what you're exposed to. You start breathing air like that. So in the beginning, it may not always be comfortable, but you'll end up learning to breathe fresh air. And when you breathe fresh air, you're open to fresh ideas. And when you open to fresh ideas, you open up to fresh emotions and feelings. There's an expression they use, I don't know who uses, but I remember reading, I've incorporated it into my lexicon. It's called the cognitive life raft. It's a very interesting concept. It's going back to fear. Think of it like this. Think of like a child who's scared of the boogeyman, an imaginary monster. In the dark, when you close the door, the child thinks there's a monster in the closet or under the bed. Now, if you're a good parent, you could just tell the child, if you're not a good parent, you could say to the child, stop being ridiculous, there's no such thing as monsters. But a child emotionally is afraid. It has nothing to do with what you say. The child, for some reason, has dreamt something, maybe saw something, whatever. So what's a good parent to do? You try to show the child that there's nothing to be afraid of, not by saying don't be ridiculous and shut the child up, by somewhat, I don't say playing along, but somewhat finding a way that the child will relate. So, for example, you could say a child is, let's say, hiding under the table because it's afraid of a stranger that walked into the door. Yeah, and there's no basis for the fear. So you could pull the child out and just scare the child, living daily outside the child, and say, "Don't be afraid," or you can tell the child, let's imagine that the person who walked in the door is an angel, a beautiful person, came with gifts. Now the child is still afraid, but the mind of the child has this cognitive life raft. It can imagine that, and that begins to be an imagination that plays in the mind of the child. And as you build that life raft, in the mind, the child starts feeling a little safer, and then it may peek out from under the table and say, I look at the person, not so scary. So one of the ways to deal with emotional fears and insecurities is not to try to head on and say, hey, don't be afraid, there's nothing to be afraid of, it's ridiculous. Go out on a date and stop feeling that you're going to be rejected. That will not usually work with someone who's emotionally fearful because a brilliant mind can't speak to a crying heart. It doesn't work that way. But you could help a person develop an imagination that may be right now imaginary. At least in your mind, to try to imagine that it's safe. And what happens after a while, when you do that for a while, you can actually create this cognitive life raft, which means like in the mind, a life raft that you're riding on that protects you, can slowly begin to spill over and affect your emotions and allow your emotions to stop being so fearful. So that's where the mind can teach and educate the heart. And this is also common if you think about it in life. When people train, let's say they go to the army, or they train in some more risky type of ventures, tightrope walkers, or people who do different type of risky things. I'm not talking about recklessness. So how do you train somebody who doesn't even know how to walk on a tightrope? Suddenly they're going to walk on a tightrope. So obviously you put a net below, you put a safety net, but you also do small exercises to train the mind to not be so afraid. And once the mind becomes less afraid, the emotions are more receptive. Now this takes time. Especially, for example, in the army, in the military, you train for months until you really train your body just to naturally, instinctively, and impulsively know how to react in a dangerous situation. Most of us, A dangerous situation, if you were not trained, you're probably going to panic. Someone who's trained, why don't they panic? They don't have the same emotional reactions as we do. They do, but they've been trained enough times with their mind, they've been trained, this is how you react. You do it once, twice, 3, 5, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 times. So then when a real situation comes up, you've been trained not to panic. This cannot be done overnight. This is how the mind trains the heart. So fear is an emotion in the heart. It's not in the mind. It could be in the mind as well. But the mind has that objectivity that can look at a situation and say, well, it doesn't make sense why I'm afraid. But you're still afraid. So how do you train the heart? One of the ways is enough contemplation, enough focus, that you slowly train yourself. So in addition to what I said before, being around people that are positive also helps you think. If you think with courage, you ultimately will feel courage. That's the point. Now you may not feel it right away. It may take some time. You know, they tell this joke about the guy who couldn't sleep at night because he had nightmares. He was terrified that there's a monster under his bed. So he started going to different therapists, and finally he found a psychiatrist who charged, plenty high, a top dollar, $400 or $500 a session. And he told him it's going to take time. Meanwhile he's coming every week and he's spending good money, and his nightmares are not going away. I mean, after a few months, how much money can you spend just on that? So one day he meets his rabbi. And the rabbi says, how are things going? He says, it's bad. I can't sleep at night. I'm going to the psychiatrist. Now I also can't sleep because I'm in deficit. I'm losing money. So now it's double nightmare. And the rabbi says to him, gave him an idea, gave him advice. And from then on, no more nightmares. He sleeps peacefully and costs nothing. So he stopped going to his sessions. The psychiatrist meets him or calls him one day and says, what happened to you? Where are you? I'm going into a deficit. I need you to come because I need some, That's a joke. That's just a footnote. So he says, listen, doctor, my rabbi solved all my problems and didn't cost me anything, and it's all over. What do I need to come to you for? He says, what did he tell you? He told me to cut off the legs of my bed. See, his bed had legs on it, so it was above ground, so there was room to think of monsters there. Once the bed was lying flat on the ground, obviously there's no monster can fit in. That's an example. So of course you could tell the guy, you're crazy, what kind of monsters? Shine a flashlight under the bed and see there's no monster. But then as soon as you go back into bed, you think the monster maybe you gotten back, emotional craziness that we all have. So the rabbi was brilliant. He just said, cut the legs. There can't be a monster. The bed is on the floor. Anyway, just an example. Sometime I wish we could diffuse all fears that way. But so by the way, sometimes you could, with humor. And sometimes, just see, what are you afraid of? And you start saying, it's true, what am I afraid of? Now, as I said, that's not going to work overnight and just get rid of things. But it's a method. It's a method that can be used where you begin to diffuse some of the intensity and seriousness. Lighten up a bit. You went on a date, and someone obsesses, what is she thinking? What is he thinking? And for hours they analyze. And then someone says, you know what? Stop, lighten up, So let's say even if you messed up, so what? You're a human being. If it's meant to be, it's meant to be. But we become so obsessed and we become so consumed with ourselves. There's a bigger plan. There's a mystery. Trust me, marriage is a big mystery. It's a bigger mystery than you think it is. The ones that are married longer will tell you it's a bigger mystery than those that never got married. They think you mastered the art of marriage. You show me someone who's happily married and told you they mastered the art. They'll laugh if you tell them that. They didn't say they mastered that. They've learned to let go. That's what they learned to do. They learn not to take yourself so seriously and start transcending yourself. It's not all about you. That's the sad reality of single life, that you're so consumed with you because you have no one else to take care of except yourself. So in marriage is not that way. You guys stop being so cynical and stop being so self-absorbed. There's only another person around, Maybe it's a good thing. You don't think about yourself all the time. You're thinking about somebody else. And not like the guy that goes on a date with a girl and he talks about himself for 2 hours and then he turns to her and says, okay, enough about me. Now what do you think about me? 2 stages of narcissism. One is first I talk about myself and then I have someone else talk about me. And never occurred to him that maybe there's a time that she should talk about herself. There's another person here. Okay, I guess men have this issue maybe more than women, I'm not sure. I once heard a little girl told her mother was pregnant. She says, "Mommy, how do you have room inside you for another life, another child, a person?" And I thought to myself, that's a great question. Many men don't have room outside of themselves for somebody else, let alone inside. And here a woman is able to carry a child, and it's not just in a little closet. Her whole being is taken over by this life. Everything is affected from head to toe. Interesting, right? The physiological nature. Maybe that's why women are better nurturers and so on. Because men have a difficulty, as I said, even having room outside of you. Can you imagine carrying what do you think? Carrying a child 9 months, and you say, "What's this child want from me? Can I get it? What are you doing here? I have an ego. I have things to do. I have a job. What's this baby inside of me?" That's what men would do. I don't know what would happen. So that's as an aside. Okay, to get back to the topic at hand. So we're talking about celebrating vulnerability is the key here. Is to recognize that the status quo, the natural state of a person is really a fearless person. That we're not afraid of vulnerability because there's nothing to be afraid of. Now, I'm not denying that we live in a world where we cannot live that way, because we do have people that are can be predators and can be hurtful and have been hurtful. But the key thing is not to suddenly change your identity as a result of that. It's recognize, yes, that's true, that's a reality, but I don't have to become a hostile person because I live around with hostilities. Some people think because I swim with sharks, I have to become a shark. No, maybe you have to know how to play the game, the rules of the game, but does that mean your identity has shifted? And you'll see all great people, all people who have mastered something in their lives, are never identified by their circumstances. And you see it time and again. All the best people you'll meet, the healthiest people, many people initially say, they must be healthy, they must be happy because why? They didn't suffer. Really, that's not true at all. Some people suffered horribly, and came out more refined, more elevated, more dignified, because they didn't let the suffering shape them. That's the key here. It's not a question whether one suffered, one didn't suffer. I know many people who haven't suffered much and who have a privileged life and are miserable day and night. They have everything they need, everything they want, they're miserable. So it has nothing to do with the circumstances of your life, what the deck of cards, what hand of cards you've been dealt. We all are dealt, we have our strengths and our weaknesses. It's all to do with how you deal with it, how you navigate the landscape. So in a sense, you can say how to overcome relationship insecurity. The key is to recognize that really you're a secure person. You just may not know it yet. I don't know if anybody's ever told it to you that way. Think about that. That no matter how insecure you may think you are and fearful, you just haven't met yourself yet. You've met a part of yourself. You've met the part that's been hurt. You've met the part that maybe is protecting itself. You've met the part that's afraid of being hurt again, and so on. I understand, and no, I'm not denying that. But that's not. Maybe it's time to say, welcome to the real you. The real you. I always love this story about one of the students of the Baal Shem Tov. And he came to Baal Shem Tov and he said he wanted to have a divine revelation. He wanted to see Eliyahu HaNavi. That's considered in Jewish thought, Jewish history, and Jewish literature and tradition. To see Elijah the prophet is like a divine revelation. So the Baal Shem Tov sent him for the holidays, Rosh Hashanah, to go to a certain town. He says, you'll meet Eliyahu HaNavi there. Okay. He tells him what address to go to, and he'll stay there. The guy sets off, prepares all his needs, and he comes. He's about to knock on the door where the Baal Shem Tov told him to go, and he hears behind the door a racket. He hears a father yelling, a mother yelling, children running around, a real chaos. So first he throws the wrong address, he double checks, no, that's the place. Knocks on the door, it's the day before Rosh Hashanah. He walks in, a mess, and he sees it's a very impoverished home, a lot of children, a father and mother, they're arguing, and there's no food. The mother's telling the father, we have no food, we have no clothing for the children. It's Rosh Hashanah tonight. What are we going to do? And okay, this student of the Baal Shem Tov obviously was open. Who knows? He doesn't know what the Baal Shem Tov meant. This is the place for him to be. So he says to them, listen, I'd like you to, if you have an extra room I'm willing to pay for it. Not only that, I'm willing to pay for your meals, and I'm buy clothing for your children, and let's have a festive Rosh Hashanah. So they're so delighted, like a miracle. Anyway, that's what happened. That night came, the holiday came, they bought some clothing for the children, everybody had food to eat, it was a festive meal, everything they needed. Rosh Hashanah came and gone. He stayed there, he went to pray in the synagogue. After Rosh Hashanah, it was a nice family, but that was that. He comes back to Mezhebush where the Baal Shem Tov lived, and the Baal Shem Tov says to Baal Shem Tov, it was a very nice holiday, but I didn't meet Eliyahu Navi. It was a family that was in need, and I obviously helped them. And Baal Shem Tov says, go back for Yom Kippur. Same place. So, of course, he goes back, and same story. As he's arriving there the night before Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur is a fast day, but the day before there's a festive meal as well, and so on. And same thing. The children are running around, and they don't know what they're going to do. They're all desperate. Suddenly he hears from the other side of the door, the woman says to her husband, you know what? But maybe God will send Eliyahu Navi again like he sent him for Rosh Hashanah. Maybe he'll send Elijah again. So he suddenly realized what the Baal Shem Tov meant. He was looking for Elijah somewhere out there, and it ended up being, it's sometimes you. You just have to discover yourself, Sometimes it's you just don't know your potential. So basically, Baal Shem Tov says, look in the mirror. You may be the salvation you're looking for. We often look for help and hope elsewhere, out there. Maybe it's right here inside of you. That's when you recognize and respect and appreciate you were created in the divine image. And you have a divine element. You think the divine can be wounded and hurt by the indignities and the injustices and the pains of humans. It can't. You're just not aware of it. So on your outer layers, you feel hurt, and it's legitimate. It's true, it is. I'm not saying it isn't. But there are deeper layers, and that's where the healing comes from. The challenge is, how do you cut to the deepest part of your psyche? That's the challenge. How do you find forces that help you get to that well spring that's not polluted, that's not been affected by outer stuff? And I'm not suggesting it's easy. Again, it takes work. It takes the work, first of all, having people around you, sum up what I said before, that believe in you, that know about that part in you, and they can help expose it. People who themselves are in touch with that part of themselves, obviously is a tremendous asset. People give you some objective advice. And yes, being a little lighter and don't take yourself so seriously, And that type of approach, the more you come in touch with that part of your soul, the more you access a place that's deeper than all the hurt that you've experienced. And then when you're able to access that, in a sense, going back to your inner child that has no problem celebrating vulnerability. Now, the interesting thing is, you have both sides. You know the realities of the world, so you prepare properly. Look at Jacob when he prepares to meet his brother Esau. After 20 years of being apart, and Esau wanted to kill him. And Jacob wasn't sure what's going to happen. So he sends messengers. In the chapter in the Torah tells us. So he sends messengers to go check it out. And lo and behold, yes, Esau is marching with 400 men to war. So what does Jacob do? He does three things. He prays to God to protect him. He prepares a bribe to appease his brother. Appeasement. And he prepares for war. Now thank God he only needed the first 2 out of 3. He didn't need the war. Because the appeasing, and once Esau saw him, and of course the prayer, helped. To what extent it helped is two opinions, whether they reconciled entirely or partially. But war for sure not. What do you learn from this? Yeah, Jacob could have gone into panic mode. And no, he stole the blessings from Esau. Esau had sworn to kill him. Esau was a warrior. It wasn't like he's dealing with a nice guy. And Esau had good reasons. So he could have gone into, he could have said it's wishful thinking. I hope that he'd have changed after 20 years. But he didn't change. He's marching. No. He maintained his composure. And he prayed. He always connect to that which is above. Because at the end of the day, your strength doesn't come from your efforts. But he didn't stop with prayer. He didn't just say, I'll pray and God will take care of the rest. No. He also used this good seichel, his intelligence, to prepare a bribe to appease him. Because you could say he prayed and went to war. No, appeasing is also an option. And he also prepared for war. Last resort, you have to prepare. You never know what's going to happen. This is the approach of a healthy approach. He could have said, listen, it's too bad. The rest of my life I'm going to have to run from Esav. He's going to be my mortal enemy. Jacob, even after knowing that Esav is marching, still maintained, I need a connection with God. I need to be strong inside, my faith, my trust. And I have to maintain my composure. I have to be strong. Then I used the practical other methods, and the appeasement worked. The point is, in other words, that even faced with real mortal danger and stuff like that, there's no panic, there's no fear, because Jacob knew in his heart that if he prays and he connects to what he needs to connect, he will be able to deal with anything. Yes, sometimes you need war, sometimes you need other approaches. It's the healthy approach to things. It's a healthy approach how we deal with adversity and how we deal with negative things. Many of us, we see an enemy, oh yeah, of course, that's what I deserve. That's my life. I'm destined to battle. I'll never have it good. But if you look at the history of the Jewish people, starting with Jacob and all the others, we did make it. It's 4,000 years later almost. It's 3,800 years from those stories. And we made it. That means our grandparents had something in them that they kept forging ahead, while being prudent as well. So the point is that even when you prepare for war if necessary, but you don't become a warrior. That's not who you are. That's if I have to do it, I have to do it last resort. Look at the 6-day war in Israel. The miracle, literally. Everybody knew it was a miracle. 5 armies surrounded Israel. Outnumbered Israel in every possible way. And yet Israel won the war in 6 days. No one really understands how and why. But there's no question, everybody knows there was something divine. There's a divine hand. And there was a certain trust. And a psychological level, when you know you're standing for the right cause, numbers don't matter. You're fighting for what is right. And when you have that on your side, it outnumbers large numbers of weapons and military. So the point is, the bottom line is, that when it comes to overcoming relationship insecurity, is to recognize that we really are secure individuals. And it's waiting for you to, your inner self is waiting for you to say, hello, I would like to get to know you. So maybe tonight we should all think about, look in the mirror, or you don't have to look in the mirror, you can look at your iPhone and take a selfie or whatever and say, okay, I'd like to get to know you. I'd like to get to know the real you. How about that? That's interesting, right? Maybe you should go on a date with yourself type of thing. I don't mean that in a weird way. I meant to say, get to know yourself. How do you get to know yourself? You study a little about the soul. You study about parts of yourself maybe you're not even aware of. We all know there are parts of ourselves we're not aware of. We have all kinds of potential. How do we usually discover our potential? By accident, by mistake. You try something else, suddenly you're good at this. Nobody comes to you with a little note and say, here are your God-given strengths and abilities. Most of them come through trial and error, and you try this, you try that, and suddenly, hey, I'm not bad at this, not bad at this, not bad at that. Now, how many other strengths do you have inside of you that you haven't yet discovered? And if you tell me you discover it all, you understand the response to that. You're that arrogant to think that, And to say, no, I don't have any more strengths, I don't think anybody on earth can make such a statement. Just think about that. How can you make such a statement? You don't even know what you're made of. How do you know you don't have the strengths? Just because you don't know doesn't mean it's not there. To put it back in that context. So my friends, I'm here to tell you, you're all very secure, courageous, dignified, and you have unbelievable and unique potential, more than you ever can imagine. What you need to do is find out and recognize that, and meet people who believe in that in you, and help you access it. And need objective advice to help you get beyond your own mirage or your own delusions. That's the key to it all. Let someone hold your hand, let somebody throw you the rope and give you some hope from a greater and higher place. That's what it's all about. I could say, studying through my lifetime, Torah, especially the mystical, the spiritual teachings, it's all about that. At the end of the day, that's what it sums up, that you have powers inside of us, that is the soul, that's deeper than you can ever imagine. And the question is, how do you access it? And how can you hold on to it, even when we go back into our routines and our patterns and all the old stuff, because that's going to be the trap. Everything I just said now may resonate, you may like it, it's all that, but it's like a song. You hear it, and then the song ends. Now you move back to your old self. So the question and challenge you have to ask yourself, how do I hold on to the song? How do I hold on to the inspiration? And that's where you need to find those connecting dots, whether it's in the morning saying, Moda'ani, I acknowledge for you giving me my soul back, or it's different prayers, or it's things you study, or it's partners, friends you meet. You have to keep the fire burning. If you don't do it, it'll go back as a distant memory. Yeah, inside of you, you have it, but your patterns will take over. I don't know what it is, but they say that around 18 times it's necessary to repeat something for it to become a new habit. You know, they say that when you send spam, 18 emails, the 18th email you start opening up. I don't know if it's exactly 18 or it's 19 or 17, but the idea is you cannot just expect that a one-time injection is going to work. You need something repetitive, which is why we pray 3 times a day and why we have a Shabbat every 7 days a week. Why every morning we say Modani and all these things. They're not to be repetitive. They're meant to help develop a routine of something that's a little more spiritual to counter the routines that we have that are not spiritual and are very self-defeating. So basically introducing routines in our lives that are life-affirming, that are life-inspiring, that are uplifting. That's what it comes down to. That's what prayer is about. That's what Shabbat is about. That's what all types of spiritual awareness is about. It's being aware of things that are more powerful and higher than we are, so they can lift us up from the quagmire and from the swamp that we sometimes get stuck in due to our own negative image and self-defeating prophecies. So in this week of Jacob's courage, I want to wish everybody to dig in deep inside. You have a Jacob inside of you. You have an Abraham, and Isaac, a Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, and all the Moses and Joshua and all Mordechai and all the great ones with all their strengths. We carry them in our genes. So you have that as an additional asset. And if we were able to access all our assets in our arsenal, we would be formidable. Nothing would be indestructible. And when you're indestructible, you can celebrate your vulnerability. I'll let you wrap your head around that. So everyone have a very pleasant week, a courageous week, and hope you make real strides in building your security. That's your birthright. And I want to dance at your weddings shortly. That's the bottom line, proof of the pudding that we've gotten beyond those insecurities and we're able to find the right one and be able to be vulnerable with somebody in your life. It's a beautiful thing. So God bless everybody in that direction. We will continue this class Wednesday night, live, every week, hopefully until everybody on earth is courageous enough, and then I can say, the class has achieved its objectives, and we'll move on to conquer higher horizons. So everyone have a very good week and a blessed week. Be well. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now translate it into action. That's the key. That's the key.
How did you lose so much weight? You look great.
Everyone's telling me this, but I don't think I did.